scientists are makers, and the tools they use for research and experimentation often don't come off the shelf. Join my friends Kishore Hari and Indre Viscontis as they visit the labs and workshops where scientists engineer custom tools and technologies to better understand our world. This is Science in Progress.
So one of the things I loved about Rich is how self-made he is. Like, he didn't go to school for marine biology for 20 years and then, become an expert at this.
Yeah, he just learned by doing.
And because he loves it.
Absolutely. It shows with every fiber of his being that he loves cephalopods, octopuses, corals, everything about the sea.
Yeah, and so I think the one thing that I'm really curious about is how does he actually breed them at home? I mean,
I was a little weirded out by that. First of all, how do you do that? What equipment do you need at home? And how do you take what's here at an aquarium and port it to your house and still maintain it? But moreover, just the mentality of what does a lab look like in somebody's home where you're breeding octopuses?
Yeah, I mean, the equipment is one thing. You need to get the salination right, you need to get the temperature right. That seems really complicated. But also, where do you get the octopus eggs? Babies? How do you, has he got some embryos that he's putting together?
Flipping through a mail order catalog?
Right? How does it work?
Welcome to the Secret Home Lab. People always ask me, can I have an octopus? Should I have an octopus? And I think the answer is yes and no. If you're a nut and you really love the animal, get an octopus, right? They're short-lived, so you gotta be prepared for that. They take all this kind of underlying knowledge of how to keep salt water, so you have to be prepared for that. If you've got that and you're gonna keep it responsibly, go for it. They're really wonderful critters, but they're not a critter to be taken in lightly. This is dumb. This is just not a good idea for most people. It's not a good idea for me in reality, but I love it, so I do it. So this is a tiny male octopus chirchier, lesser Pacific striped octopus, and it's in the back corner right now, covered in sand. That's one of the ways they camouflage themselves from predators. Well, there's a kind of an underneath layer that I take for granted, which is being able to keep coral in a saltwater tank. If you can keep coral in a saltwater tank and everything that you need to do to be able to make that happen, these become pretty easy. So if we ignore that for now, what you do every day is make sure they're alive, make sure they're looking healthy, make sure they're entertained. So one of the ways I do that is give them live foods, because I don't want them to get bored. If they get bored, they might get surly. Give them a place to feel comfortable, and just keep checking on them and mate them every once in a while. Once they're on eggs, leave them alone.
What kind of food do they eat?
They eat any kind of small crustacean is usually what they feed them. So either I'll go to the bait shop and get some small shrimp for them, or I can use some freshwater shrimp from time to time, not the best food from different nutritional profiles from freshwater and saltwater. Or my favorite thing and the best thing I found is local crabs. So you can go, I live in Alameda, so you can go down many places around the shore and flip some rocks and get some crabs. And I feel good about that because I'm not taking that many crabs, so.
What does it look like when they're mating? Is this a involved experience for them?
Yeah, this is one of the ones that we believe, I don't think we've done the experiment yet, but we believe is a scary mating. So the male often will mate on the female on her mantle, so very far away from her mouth parts, and move his hectocotylized arm into her mantle cavity and mate and then get away from each other. Although some other mating stuff has been seen recently. So we assume that there's danger to the male at that point. We never have enough of these animals to do the experiment to just leave them together and see what happens. But probably all accounts point to the idea that leaving them together would likely end up in cannibalism or strangulation. Octopuses do weird things.
So when you mate them, how do you actually manage the mating?
Put them together in a tank, usually put them in the female's tank, so the mating, so she's more comfortable, because we're worried about her eating him, not about him eating her. And then I've got these brushes here. Little paintbrushes are really good ways to manipulate them because they don't seem to like how they feel. And I've got a small net that I can scoop them out with, so manipulate them like that, soft things that are not going to hurt them. I don't want to grab them or pick them up. Animals that have black and white striped, bright coloration in that way, that tends to mean don't touch me. And a lot of octopuses have some kind of cephalotoxin. Actually, we assume that all cephalopods have some kind of cephalotoxin. I don't want to be the one to find out how potent it is against people. The gestation for these guys after mating is about 3 weeks. So mating to eggs, 3 weeks, and then it could be another 3 to 4 weeks till the eggs hatch. These are a large-egged octopus, which means their young are basically a small octopus. So they get born, they get hatched, and they go down to the bottom, and they're easy to feed. Small-egged octopuses go into the plankton. It's a whole nightmare. We don't know how to do it, or we haven't been very successful at raising those. But these guys are much easier. They're not easy, but they're much easier because then you've got to feed them all. They usually hatch in the middle of the night, which is also so convenient. But I've caught them actually hatching, which is pretty exciting. And this one here, who's probably on his way out, is a captive bred one. So he was hatched about a year and a half ago. He's really old. I've also got 2 Wonderpus photogenicus in the system, a tiny one over here and a bigger one over here. And that's just a very cool octopus. That's really what got me into octopuses. I had done cuttlefish before that in this system. That's what this was originally built for. And the Wonderpuses were available and I got one and I was able to keep it for 9 months at the time. And that, I think, was in 2006. And I was able to get it to do natural behaviors, bury in the sand. And before that, they were generally thought to be impossible to keep. So, and actually there was a lot of, this was before I had my job, and there was a lot of tension between me and some cephalopod researchers about the idea of, you shouldn't have these animals because we don't know the status of their natural populations. And, are a lot of hobbyists going to start to demand them, and we're going to start to deplete their populations. So I was very, I guess I would say, scientific in it, and everything I wrote up about it, because I always think knowledge is better than not knowledge, would have a big disclaimer for these animals are not easy to keep. They shouldn't be your first animal. We don't know their natural populations. We don't want to overcollect them. Don't get these unless you're a nut, essentially, and then talk about them. And that seemed to go a long way to making academics take me more seriously, which was really wonderful. And then I was listed as one of the authors on the Wonderpus because it turns out their patterns are unique to each individual. So you can actually get the patterns in a photograph, go back later and look at the same animal.
Where are the Wonderpus native to?
The Wonderpus are native to the South Pacific. So any place.
Shallow water?
Shallow water, yeah, so you'll see them in the Philippines. You'll see them in, I think they've been seen in Australia, definitely in Indonesia. It's a great animal in the wild. They were photographed for a long time before they were given a description, and that's why they have the kind of whimsical description of Wonderpus photogenicus.
So now that you've kept this Wonderpus now for, this is a few years back, you started doing it. Are we actually seeing hobbyists actually keep more Wonderpuses now?
No, it goes in little waves, but the world has changed, right? So while the internet is horrible in some ways for information sharing, it's also pretty great for information sharing. And the word seems to have gotten out that octopuses are not something to get on a whim. And that seems to have taken root. And I don't see nearly as many octopuses as I used to see offered for sale anywhere, or even collected. Because I'm always looking at the importer lists as well, and we just don't see as many as we used to, which I think is so great.
That's great that people aren't keeping octopuses?
It's great that they're not keeping them on a whim. So we kind of have this supermarket model of animals, and I don't like that. There's no reason to go browse to get an animal. I'd like it all to switch to a collect to order or order to collect system where you call up somebody and say, I want this animal, and they go get it for you instead of always having them ready in case someone wants them. And we kind of have seen that shift with octopuses, which is great. And there's a few other fish we see that with as well, which is good because, hard to keep animals, you get a bunch of them in, they're hard to keep. You want to get them to people who want them. So getting them to the people who want them as soon as they want them is really the way to do it. I think what you see at the aquarium or here is essentially the same thing. It's the same mindset behind all of it. The filtration mindset's the same, the separation's the same. If I were setting up a breeding system at work for these octopus, it would look almost exactly like this. So I couldn't get traction to have these guys at work because they're small and they hide all the time, so I set it up here myself. Keeping all this together is not just putting in some pumps and some salt water. It's really having an understanding of what you think is happening in a saltwater system. So everyone's got a different idea of that. So as long as you have your idea of it and you can support that idea and are willing to change over time because you're going to, that's great. So once you've got that underlying idea, you can build that system to support that idea. So I am a big fan of automation because I am lazy. And now that my real job during the day is doing this at home is less exciting. And my wife will tell you that. I'll say I spend hardly any time, and my wife will say he spends hours and hours and hours doing all of this. As a person and with a family, we like to go on vacation, so I like to travel. And then I also travel for work, so that's compounded. So what I want is a lot of automation that I can control and see while I'm not here to be able to troubleshoot the system if there's a problem. So things I think are important is good water quality. So I want a good protein skimmer. I want some carbon dosing to be able to get bacteria to be using up the nutrients I don't want in the system. You want a lot of bacterial areas. Just everything in the tank gives bacteria a place to live. I want a lot of water motion and good oxygenation, so I use a lot of wave-making devices. I want stability overall, so I have automatic top-off that I can trust, so it keeps the salinity the same. I've got a calcium reactor, so it keeps the alkalinity the same. I dose Kalkwasser, which also keeps the alkalinity the same. And a lot of system volume. I like big water volume because the bigger the volume, the more stable it is. So everything in this room comes from one water source, which is on the other side of the house, under the house. And that water comes in there. It's actually split. It comes into this tank and to this tank. From this tank, it drains into this tank, which drains into this tank, which then goes back under the house all the way to the other side. This set of cubes drains into this set of cubes, which drains into this tank, which drains into this tank. This tank has a pump in it that feeds this tank, which then drains again, and then goes back into this tank, which then goes back under the house. And there is the heart of the system. I guess it's more of a torso of the system. So we're under the house now in a 40-inch crawl space, which is a great place to put a bunch of noisy stuff and stuff that might leak. So the mess under here, no one ever sees but me. If it floods down here, it's not a problem because we're at ground level. And this is where the heart and the pumps and basically the organs of the system actually live. And right over here is what we call a sump. And this is really part of this, they're just separated. And I like a big sump on a system because it's a big water volume that just is sitting. So this is the water gets processed here, and then it flows through these two tanks, and it settles any detritus, and it sets to the bottom, and then it gets pumped out from another pump, and it goes to the system in the other room, both of the systems in the house, like 40, 50 feet away. And then it flows back through and comes back over into these two pipes over here, which is what gets it into the system. So the different components down here, there's a lot, so I'll just name them off real quick. There's protein skimmer. This protein skimmer does exactly what seafoam is. When you see seafoam on the beach, that's exactly what this is. We're recreating that in a small contained area. And that's a bunch of protein, a bunch of goo in the water that's combined with bubbles, and those bubbles have coalesced into a foam, which then comes out the top of the neck of that thing and goes into a bucket, which then I can pump out to drain. So that's a great piece of equipment that does a lot of the filtration naturally. And then there's a lot of biological filtration. All the rock that's in the tank also has got bacteria in it, and that bacteria eats up the fish waste and whatever ammonia and nitrate or nitrators in the water. There's a calcium reactor, which helps keep the calcium and the alkalinity at the same levels we want it to be. There's a Kalkwasser mixing bin, which is calcium hydroxide mixed with fresh water that gets dosed into the tank, and that's also for alkalinity and calcium. There's vinegar that gets dosed by this dosing pump, which helps grow bacteria, which helps keep some nutrient levels down. This is actually an experiment for me right now. This is dosing lanthanum chloride, which helps bring down the phosphates, which is also an experiment for me right now. And I think that's pretty much, oh, and then over here And even further on the other side under the house, this is a reservoir of fresh salt water. So when I need to do a water change, the water comes from these tanks, gets moved over to here. And behind you in an uninteresting gray bin is a freshwater reservoir. The filters on the door are actually filtering two things. The one on the left is a carbon reactor. And you can put various media, but I just use granular activated carbon. And the other 5 pieces of equipment are filtering any water I need for the room. So fresh water. So any top off, right, because salt doesn't evaporate, it's just water does, and that gets put back into the tank that way. Then we've got heaters. There's heaters that heat up the tank. Mostly I just keep the heaters in the display tanks because heating down here is silly. And then I've got various ways to make all of this work together. So I've come to find that alkalinity is what I think is the #1 parameter I want to keep stable and at the level I want it set at. And primarily, this system drives a display coral tank, and alkalinity is very important for those corals. So that's my main goal. Now there's other things that are important. I just think alkalinity is kind of the most important. So the calcium reactor, what happens here is water runs through it and CO2 is dosed into it, lowering the pH, dissolving the media inside, liberating the calcium, which then gets into the tank and used. So I think that gives a nice baseline for your calcium levels and your alkalinity levels. And I'm finding that Kalkwasser really helps, really punches and keeps your levels where you want them to be. Yeah, I'm running experiments in here all the time. This is a constant science project. That's one of the fun parts about it. I mean, besides having mad scientist tubes everywhere. So I'm constantly looking at different levels and trying to decide what's important, what isn't important, what anecdotally is actually matters and doesn't actually matter. And there's so much anecdote in this stuff because it's really hard to run, any kind of real regimented test. So I like to test things that people think are important and find out if they are or not. So one of the things that people were able to control and test for in the last 10 years has been phosphate. So phosphate became the new thing that everyone was trying to control. I never wanted to control phosphate because the early ways to control it were a real pain and labor intensive, and I don't want to do labor. So I let my phosphates get really high, 20 times, I think, 50 times what people recommend, and have no problem in my tank. So what's going on there? Why is that possible? I don't know. I mean, it could be lots of reasons. It could be stability. Your animals are adapting to the parameters you put them in. I feed an awful lot, so I'm sure that's got a lot to do with it. That's definitely got a lot to do with the phosphate, but the animals are getting a lot of food as well. I also keep my alkalinity very high, so it could be a lot of things going on there. It's been high for several years now, 4 or 5 years, and I'm that guy everyone points to and says, look, he can do it. Now I'm gonna try to bring it down and see what happens. So this is a system over here to dose lanthanum chloride. You mix right now I'm doing 10 milliliters of lanthanum chloride to a liter of fresh water, and it gets dosed. Right now I'm dosing 30 milliliters a day, and it goes into the skimmer where it's exported. So it binds with the phosphate and makes a flocculant, which you don't want everywhere in your tank. It can bind to the glass, it can bind to pump parts. So it's going right into there and coming right out, which, if this experiment works out, is a great lazy way to be able to do it. Also, it's an easier way, a more efficient way. I want to be efficient because I want to work smart, not hard, and I want it to matter when I'm working. So we'll see. I've already lowered the phosphate from 1.58. That's a number that any reef person will probably go 1.58. They want to keep it at 0.05 or less. So it's gone from 1.58 down to 0.92. And now I'm going to kind of maintain it there for a while and then bring it down even more slowly. These are called the dosing pump from Apex. Neptune Systems makes this. They also make the controller I use that runs the house. And these pumps are really hip because they're controlled by a controller. So I've got 6 channels of dosing possibilities. I go to my computer and I can set them all at once. I can set them from my phone if I want to, and they will automatically dose throughout the day to whatever levels I want them to do. These two are actually doing constant water changes. So this one's pulling water out of the tank to drain, this one's pulling it out of the reservoir into the tank at the same rate. And this one's pumping vinegar in, and this one's pumping kalkwasser in. These are really, really cool. Very low power, very low voltage, which is the same thing. And this is the actual peristaltic part, the tubing. And when these go bad after a year or so, you just pop it off, pop a new one on. Very low maintenance, super easy to use. So we're in the bathroom. This is the extra bathroom we have in the house. That's also the back entrance to the tank. And this is where the brains of the tank are. And I didn't plan it this way, it just worked out really perfectly. We put a new door in, and this area became really great space for controls. And over the years, it's changed a lot. And what you see is this DJ power strip, and then this controller. This is a model made by Apex. Neptune Systems, Apex it's called. And these are the two things that really make everything go. This is the power of the distributed system. I still believe in not having all the eggs that run a system in one basket. So the main pumps are on here. They're all labeled so we know what it is. There's an exhaust fan as well. And just the pumps that are really the actual hearts of the system, they're on their own circuit. I don't want them to be touched by anything. This thing though now, the Apex controls almost everything else in the system now. It's a phenomenal little piece of equipment. It's really evolved as well over the years. And basically it does two things. It does three things. It's got a lot of probes attached to it, so you can get a bunch of automated readings through probes, which is much better than doing titration tests. It's also got this thing called an energy bar, which is basically a bunch of controlled outlets. It's also got some variable speed outlets that come out of there in 24 volt power as well, DC. And you can control many things that way. It's also got these little modules that control specific things. This one makes some pumps specifically go faster or slower. This lets me monitor PAR levels or the light levels in the tank. This makes some lights do a moon cycle. This is actually running another temperature probe for another reason. This is a wireless module that controls these Radion lights from Ecotech Marine, which are these fabulous LED lights. No longer am I doing, 400, 1,000, 1,500 watts of metal halide. So all of this now, which used to be a bunch of timers strung together by a bunch of power strips and extension cords, which was just a nightmare of worry that everything was going to burn down, has become much less of a nightmare. We're actually using this system for a coral spawning project we're working on at work at the aquarium. But that's the first time we've used this particular kind of system. What's generally thought of in public aquariums is, I'm this. So that's what I do. And these have now gotten to the point where they're good enough to be able to help me do my job rather than be another liability for my job. There's also larger scale automation that's used for the bigger tanks as well. But any of the automation in essence is the same. But I'm thrilled that I've got this at home and we're using it at work as well because it's a great system.
This is the show tank.
Yeah.
This is how long have you had this here?
This tank has been here for about as long as we've lived in the house, 14 years. We moved here when my daughter was born. Some of these corals were actually from the old house.
Wow, so this reef has been largely with you this entire time.
Yeah, this whole thing was broken down once when we made it a built-in, about 3 years into us being in the house. Built it into the wall. But all these things just went into another tank in the house till the work was done, then it all went back in.
This all seems a little crazy.
A little crazy? There's two things I love about this stuff. I love the animals. I mean, these are animals. They're basically rocks that grow. That's cool on its own. And they're beautiful on their own, and the fish are beautiful, and the interaction, and there's a collecting aspect, which corals do I have, and can I make them grow and look good and thrive and share them with other people? So that's really fun. The other part is, it's just a big tinkering maker project that never ends. It's lab bench science in your home that you can keep making better and better over time. And it's really intriguing. It's really fun. It's addicting, and it feels like you're getting something done.
So you've pushed from just having a show tank to having a lab, and it's sort of expanding. Where does this go from here? Are you at the limits of where a hobbyist can go?
No, there's definitely more limits. Bigger is one of the ways to go. I dread the day and I look forward to the day this tank springs a leak, right? Because eventually it's gonna happen. Something's gonna happen that this tank's gonna go bad. And it's either I'm done, which my wife says, you're not done, or we go bigger. So the lessons I've learned and the technology that's changed and the methods that have changed over the last 15 years tell me I want a tank that's about 3 or 4 feet deep, 3 or 4 feet tall, and this is a good length. This is pretty fine. If I go very tall and the water's a foot down, I can make a huge wave in the tank. Wow. Which I think will be very exciting. Of course, that balances things. You got to get in through the top and you've got all that distance. So at that point, it's got to be big enough to get into to be able to do a lot of the maintenance. But yeah, bigger would be the way to go on this. And so having this stuff here, the tank in the home lab, gives me 100% control of everything. So work is great. We can do amazing work at California Academy of Sciences, but it's not all, I am not the god of the systems. There are other people who have to play with them. There are other people who have input on them. Here, if I want to pump, I just get a pump. At work, if I want to pump, I got to get permission from a lot of people to get a pump. So here I can experiment wildly and do whatever I think is necessary and keep animals that we're not interested in at work because they're not good for display. That's the main difference, is I'm in complete control of the system. There is a couple places I'd like to go with octopuses. The larger Pacific octopus is always one I want to keep working with. If we can get more of those and work doesn't want them, I'll definitely take them here and in Roy Caldwell's lab. I really want to crack how to raise those because that's such a great animal. The other place I'd like to go here in that room, in the lab, is to have a 300-gallon tank where I keep a Hawaiian day octopus or an octopus cyanea. That's an octopus's octopus, right? That's a smart octopus. That's a strong octopus, and I really like to work with one of those for a length of time where I'm in control of everything and see what I can get out of that experience. And I used to be a juggler for 15 years.